All right. Someone sent in a whole bunch of stuff about electric vehicle safety. Looks like we've got technical standards, training modules, the works. Someone's really diving deep into the world of EVs.
And safety is key, right? We're talking some serious voltage here, especially with those 600 V systems.
No kidding. But don't worry, by the end of this deep dive, we'll break it all down. You'll have a good grasp on EV safety, even if you're not an electrician.
What's really interesting is this isn't just about cars anymore. We're seeing these 600V systems everywhere. Trucks, construction equipment, even boats are getting in on the action.
It's like the Wild West out there, but with charging stations instead of saloons.
Exactly. And speaking of which, the EV market is absolutely exploding. Those
Okay.
e-mobility fundamentals papers you sent over really highlight that growth.
Yeah, it's incredible. And with governments pushing for more EVs on the road, the demand for technicians who know how to work on these high-voltage systems safely is going through the roof.
Absolutely. It's not just about fixing the cars. It's about doing it without, well, getting zapped.
Which brings us to the Volvo Group Safety Standard, that STD 871-003 document. It seems like the holy grail of EV safety.
It really is. What's interesting is they talk about electric products, not just vehicles. So this knowledge applies to all sorts of industries dealing with high voltage.
It's like a universal language for electrical safety. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about hazardous voltage. We see it everywhere in these documents, but what does it actually mean?
Basically, it's any voltage level that can cause you harm. And with these 600V systems we're talking about, we're definitely in hazardous voltage territory. It's a whole different ballgame from working on your dad's old car battery.
Okay, things just got real. And that's where all these roles and responsibilities come into play, right?
Huh?
The Volvo standard lays out who's in charge of what when it comes to EV safety.
Exactly. Picture a busy workshop, right?
Yeah.
You've got technicians, supervisors, managers, maybe even a shop cat roaming around.
Hopefully not near the high voltage.
Right, hopefully not. But the point is, everyone needs to know their role when it comes to safety. So you've got the overall safety supervisor there making sure everyone's following the rules.
Makes sense.
Then you have the expert electrician, or what they call the skilled person in the standard. This is someone who really understands high voltage systems inside and out.
Right, like the electrical guru of the workshop.
Exactly. And let's not forget the person directly responsible for the EV itself, the electric product responsible.
Ah, so they're the ones making sure any work on that specific vehicle is done by the book.
You got it. And it's not just some theoretical hierarchy. Remember those Amoeba Alpha training excerpts you sent? They actually show how these roles play out in real-world situations.
Yeah, especially that EV skills evaluation program. They don't mess around. It's one thing to read about safety procedures, but it's another to see them put into practice.
Absolutely. For instance, one of the most fundamental things they emphasize is working on de-energized systems whenever possible.
Basically, unplug the battery before you do anything else.
Exactly. Seems obvious, right? But the Volvo standard outlines a super detailed 6-step process for this. They even go as far as disconnecting the 12V battery, which seems a little,
Overkill.
well, it might seem that way, but it's all about eliminating any chance of hazardous energy flowing where it shouldn't. Even a small voltage can create a pathway if it's not properly isolated. Safety is all about breaking the chain.
It's like making sure a light switch is off before you start rewiring a lamp, right? But with a lot more power at stake.
Exactly, and those Amoeba Alpha training materials really drill that home. They use simulations to make sure these safety steps become second nature for technicians.
Smart. So what about those situations where you can't avoid working on a live system?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and a whole lot more dangerous. We call that live working, and it's definitely not for beginners. Those RCNC AB training YA documents you sent over both parts 1 and 2 make it very clear. This is specialized work. We're talking extensive training, strict regulations, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, those were some intense reads. They even differentiate between all sorts of live working methods: hot stick, insulating glove, bare hand, each one with its own crazy detailed procedures. It seems like you need to be at the top of your game to even think about touching a live high-voltage system.
You got that right. It's not something to be taken lightly. But hey, let's listen things up a bit. How about we take a look at what makes an EV tick? We've got all these descriptions of the components, battery packs, junction boxes.
It's like getting a peek under the hood of the future.
Exactly. It really is a whole new world under there. And speaking of which, we can't forget about the hazardous voltage interlock loop. HVIL for short. That's one of those things you might not see, but it's so important.
HVIL. That sounds serious. Like a secret code word for electricians?
Not quite. But it is a critical safety feature. Those Amoeba Alpha EV simulation rig papers explain it well. Think of it as the last line of defense against getting shocked.
Okay, I'm listening.
Basically, it's a circuit that checks all the connections in the high voltage system before any power can flow. So if anything is loose or disconnected, the HVIL shuts the whole system down, like a safety net for the whole car.
So it's like having an invisible guardian angel watching over those high voltage connections. That's reassuring, especially when you think about those vulnerable contactors in the service box we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. A good HVIL will stop those contactors from getting fried if there's a sudden interruption in the high voltage.
That's a relief. It's amazing how much thought goes into making these systems safe.
Absolutely. But even with the best technology, you still need people who know what they're doing, right? That's where all those training programs come in. The level 1 and level 2 materials you sent from CubeSite, they really emphasize hands-on experience.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of which, those Amoeba Alpha training excerpts, especially that EV skills evaluation program, they really put you to the test.
Oh, yeah. What kind of stuff do they ask?
Let me see. Well, for example, they ask where to find specific technical information, how to handle emergencies. It's not just about memorizing safety procedures. They want to make sure you really know your stuff, even if you think you do.
Right, you can't just memorize the checklist. You have to understand the why behind it.
Exactly. It's like the difference between knowing how to drive a car and understanding how the engine works.
That's a good analogy. And that kind of deep understanding is crucial when it comes to risk assessment, which is another huge part of EV safety.
So it's not enough to just follow the steps. You have to be able to spot potential dangers and know how to avoid them.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, not just reactive.
Yeah.
The RCNC AB training YA materials, both part 1 and 2, really stress that.
So it's about thinking ahead, being adaptable. That takes experience, for sure.
Yeah.
Having a network of other technicians to bounce ideas off of would be super valuable, too.
For sure. You know, the EV Work Operations Mastery M2 program you mentioned really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah. Why is that?
They actually have participants do real-world EV electrical installations, It's one thing to learn about it in a classroom, but actually getting your hands dirty, that's how you really learn.
Absolutely. Hands-on experience is everything in this field. Did any of the specific components stand out to you, like from a safety perspective?
One that comes to mind is the junction box. It seems like a small thing, but those warnings about insulation resistance testing in its documentation were pretty intense.
Yeah, what's the deal with that? It's just a junction box, right?
Well, it's responsible for distributing power throughout the whole EV electrical system. So if something goes wrong there...
Yikes. Not good.
Exactly. And those warnings you mentioned, they're talking about a specific test. If you don't do it right, you can actually damage the system. You could even make the vehicle move unexpectedly. Talk about a safety hazard.
It's amazing how even small components can have huge implications in these systems. And speaking of implications, those RCNC AB training YA materials talk about some pretty specific measurement tools for EVs. Something about 1000V SATI3.
Right. You can't just use any old multimeter when you're dealing with this kind of voltage.
I guess not.
You need tools that are built to handle those high currents. Otherwise, you risk damaging the equipment, or worse, putting yourself in danger.
It's like using a butter knife to try to cut down a tree. Not the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And on that note, those documents also stressed personal protective equipment, the right gloves, eye protection, that kind of thing.
Yeah, seems like common sense, but it's easy to forget the basics when you're focused on the task at hand.
For sure. And speaking of basics, we should probably touch on the whole idea of potential equalization.
Potential equalization. That's a new one. Is that some kind of electrical jargon?
Kind of, but it's a really important concept. It's all about making sure all the conductive parts of a system are at the same electrical potential. Basically, it prevents those sudden voltage differences that can give you a nasty shock.
So you're creating a kind of safe zone where there are no sudden jumps in voltage.
Exactly. And when you're working on EVs with so many conductive parts, that's crucial.
Makes sense. We've covered a lot today. It's incredible how much goes into making these high-voltage systems safe and reliable.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? What does the future hold for EV safety?
That's the million-dollar question, right? This field is changing so fast. But one thing that I think we'll see a lot more of is wireless charging.
Wireless charging. So you just park your EV over a pad and it charges automatically.
Exactly. No more cables to mess with.
That sounds incredibly convenient. But isn't wireless transmission of that much power, well, a little bit risky?
It's a valid concern, for sure. But they're designing safety features into those systems, too.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Things like making sure the energy only goes to your EV and preventing overheating, that kind of thing.
That's good to know. It sounds like wireless charging could be a game changer. So much potential for convenience and accessibility.
Absolutely. And as that technology develops, the safety features will only get better.
It's an exciting time to be following the world of electric vehicles, but safety always has to be the top priority.
Couldn't agree more. And that's why it's so important for everyone to learn about this stuff.
Absolutely. Even if you're not an electrician, a basic understanding of these systems and how to stay safe around them is only going to become more important as EVs become more common.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to safety.
Well said. Big thanks to you, our expert, for sharing your insights with us today. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for this electrifying deep dive. Remember, a little knowledge goes a long way, especially when it comes to staying safe in the exciting world of EVs.